I always have interesting things to say.
Welcome back to the D3 Datacast. Today we have a special episode because we have a special guest. Bob Quillman probably needs no introduction to most of the D3hoops community, but we're pleased to have him here and just looking forward to this episode. There's so many directions we could go with talking to Bob, but today we wanted to focus as a follow-up to our previous episode on his experience as a top 25 voter. Bob, why don't you, if there's any more introduction you think is necessary, why don't you fill us in on who you are and your history as a top 25 voter on the D3hoops.com top 25.
Well, I appreciate it, guys. It's an honor to be on the D3 Datacast. I've watched all the shows so far. They're awesome. So it's great to have more voices joining the D3 Hoops community. So kudos for what you're doing. Long story short, I'm a D3 Hoops fan like you guys are. And back in the day, I'm talking like, 99, 2000-ish, I got to know the crew that ran D3hoops.com, Pat Coleman in particular, Dave McHugh, those guys. I was asked to be a voter back then. So whenever the poll started, whether it was 2001 or whenever that was, I was an original voter. I stepped aside for a few years because I stopped being the radio voice of Illinois Wesleyan, at least the color commentary voice. And I thought that I didn't kind of earn my card. And so I told Pat I probably shouldn't be a voter. And then a few years later, I guess I got to realizing that I was actually watching way more games since I wasn't traveling around just with Illinois Wesleyan. And I was like, Pat, I'd probably be a better voter now than I was then. and then at some point he said, hey, we have an opening. And so most of the years the polls existed, I've been a voter, and it's a lot of fun, and I'm glad to do it.
Yeah, you mentioned your connection with Illinois Wesleyan. So I've got the shirk behind me here. We want to show great hospitality to our guest. So
I appreciate that. It's a good look. That's a good looking gym. I like that green. I see a lot of banners. And so that's a good looking place right there. Thank you, Zach.
As soon as a guest agrees to come on our show, Zach just starts pandering to them, and it's sad to see.
Yeah,
well, I appreciate that.
A little anti-pandering. We have to point out that our Calvin Knights are 1-0 in their last 1 games at Shirk. So we love Shirk too.
True. Although the last game that was an NCAA tournament game, if we want to go there, then you're 0-1. And so, we can work with stats over you stat guys like to do that.
All right, fair enough. Okay, so Bob, in the last episode, Matt put me on the spot just as in terms of what I think of when I think of a top 25. So as you approach a top 25, what does a top 25 ranking mean to you? Like what is your thought process in putting a top 25 together?
Well, you guys were right on your last episode in that I would say that all the voters think of it a little bit differently. Maybe some of us look at it a lot differently. No one's right, no one's wrong. I use the theory. One of the theories that you guys brought up, or methods, is the one I use, which is I call it the neutral court theory. So when I'm voting a team 1 and 2, the team I put 1 is a team that I believe would be favored to win a game on a neutral court versus number 2. 2 versus 3, same thing. 17, 18. I do that all the way down my ballot. And is it perfect? No, because it's a subjective poll. But I'm doing that based on the games I've watched, so what I've seen, the data I'm using. A lot of things go into it, but I'm trying to pick kind of who would be favored in a neutral court game as I order 1 through 25.
So in general, you're trying to make a preference list, essentially, who would beat who in a neutral site tournament, or who would be expected. It's not going to always happen because there's randomness, but
and it's at that present time, and so I've probably evolved. At one point in time, I was always trying to do a ballot where I was predicting the final poll. That for a while I did it that way. I said, okay, my 1 to 25 in week 4 is who I believe will finish 1 to 25 when we do this the last time after the tournament. And I just found that to be, I don't know, it was tricky doing it. There's still parts of that I really like, but I kind of evolved into this. I'm just going to stack them up based on who I think would win a game. And again, not perfect, but it's how I do it.
Yeah, of course, we want to mention there are 25 different voters, and of course, speaking with you, this is one perspective. This is a process that has no objective data, no objective way of going about putting up top 25 together. So we're certainly glad to get your input, but don't want anyone to think that this is necessarily representative of how everyone approaches it or necessarily should.
That's a great point. Is again, there's 25 voters, and if you could have 25 different shows on this in different takes. So that is a very important point.
So one question I would have for you, you mentioned the word data in your explanation there. To what degree do you use computer systems like the Massey ratings to inform your process? Do you look at them for strength of schedule, for kind of wins versus top 50, top 100? Do you look at his rankings at all before you go into your process? How if not, do you use computer rankings?
I use them all, and certainly as the year goes on, I use them even heavier. I use Massey a lot. I use Matt your efficiency ratings a lot. I even use the good old the regional ranking data on occasion. I like to understand how the teams are stacking up there. There's some value in that. I especially use anything that I can get strength of schedule, and I think Massey is really good at that. In particular, like I really like Massey's strength of schedule. There are some flaws to it that you've got to know going in. But I use all of those. I don't know how I would say I weight the data. I still am probably going way more by what I'm seeing. Like I watch as many games as I can. And that would be at least 70% of my vote. But at least 30% is probably on things that are related to data.
Okay.
Yeah. So you have obviously your top 25, but I'm guessing you have a list as the week goes on that's much longer than that for those games that you're watching. Not only how teams in your top 25 are faring, but in any given week, you got to expect that there's going to be a few that are losing and maybe not going to look as good the next week, and some teams that maybe didn't make it that are going to be coming up with some big wins. How big of a list do you usually have over the course of a season as you're watching games and considering maybe the next top 25?
Early in the season, that list is probably like 50. And then somewhere middle of the season, that list is probably like 35 or so. But that is the fun part, is I've always got this little group of teams that like I'm excited to get in. Like I am sold on them, and I know they're a top 25 team. I just can't quite make the case yet, but I've watched them and they look really good, and they're going to prove me right. And I'm going to get that opportunity. Someone's going to lose, right? I'm going to be able to slide someone in. So I always have a group of teams on my watch list, and I'm ready to slide those in as I can. I'd say within my ballot, there's a certain amount of teams you're sure about. Like maybe I feel really good up to like 17, but 18 to 25 is kind of a crapshoot. Mm-hmm. And it most of the time, quite frankly, that's how it is. You're just like, okay, 18 versus 29. I'm splitting hairs, but I'm going to go with maybe what I think to be the better resume at this point. But yeah, I've always got a list of teams where I'm ready to jump on those and get them in.
Yeah, one thing I've found looking at from the data side is sometimes 15 to 35, you can almost draw names out of a hat. And right. I don't really envy you splitting hairs every week to try to figure out who you're going to put in your ballot, because you're probably going to hear from a fan base when someone just missed versus just being on there.
And that's the part about it. That many of us are public with our ballots, and we can talk about that as we go here today. But you're going to hear from folks that, hey, you've got this team number 20 and we almost beat them. And like, hey, that's part of the fun. That's part of why Pat and his crew created the poll, because it creates interest and conversation. And so I say, bring it on. Bring on all the debate. It's fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it gives people a reason to visit the website, and it gives people a reason to talk about Division III. And I know for years the message boards, that's part of the fun, is who's going to beat who, and I can't believe you vote. I mean, it's just in fun, right? Not in real meanness. But that's part of the conversation I enjoy online.
Yeah, I think that there's, in the Division III community, you have healthy dialogue. That for the most part, you have healthy conversation. The debates are good. They're in good nature, and so I say bring them all on. They're a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think probably most of us who were on the D3 boards, as you go back to the late 90s and in through the early 2000s, would probably like to delete our first however many dozen posts on there. But it seems today, when someone tries to jump in with some unhealthy banter on Twitter, they get shot down pretty quickly and come to understand what the D3 hoops community is really like. So since so much of this is taking place on Twitter now, and so you mentioned being one of, we totaled 6 that we were very familiar with that at least on occasion post their top 25, which is cool to see from the outside, just to see, the final top 25 and then maybe how it differs on an individual basis. Do you use that at all as a voter? Does that maybe help put some teams on your radar that weren't initially? Like, how do you take that when you see other people posting their ballots?
That's something I look at. I value that, in particular, the people that you're talking about that post their ballots. I'll just use them as an example. Like Ryan, I really value his opinion, or Akiva, or just down the line, all of those guys, Mike Rainiak. I like to know what they're seeing, because they're doing the same thing I am. They're covering different parts of the country, or they're following different parts of the country. So if I look at Ryan's ballot, and he's got, let's say, he has Wabash a little ahead of John Carroll, that means something to me, because he's really zeroed in on that kind of that Great Lakes or Region 7 area. So I definitely do look at what the people are putting out there, and some people don't want to, and I get it. Like I've heard, I want to say maybe Dave McHugh say, I don't want to look at any of those before I do my own ballot. I'm the opposite. Like if someone happens to pop one of those out on a Sunday night and I haven't submitted mine yet, I definitely want to look through it to kind of like cross check mine and make sure that maybe I'm not really crazy on somebody. Like I've got someone 5 and no one else has them in the top 20. It doesn't mean I won't do it, but I want to think through it one more time.
You mentioned how you have a list that kind of grows and evolves over the course of the season. When you're making your top 25 from week to week, to what degree do you start with the previous week's ballot, your own ballot, as your starting point versus blowing it up and starting from scratch? Do you tend to, someone has to lose before I move them down? What is your philosophy there?
Well, first, I always start with my previous week ballot. I always take it out 1 to 25. I put a little column to the right, and I've got spots to write down my new 1 to 25. But saying that I always start with my prior ballot doesn't mean that someone has to lose.
Yeah.
I just want to have that frame of reference. So, like if I thought that Randolph Macon was number 1 the week before, I'm going to start there in kind of evaluating team. I'm going to look at them first, and then let's say I had Elmhurst second, I'm going to look at them. But I am not tied at all to the order. In fact, that's one of the biggest confusions with the polls is a lot of times a team won't lose, but will get passed up. And people don't understand the dynamics of that, which frustrates me, but I guess I get it. The poll 1 to 25 is a function of poll voting points. That's the way you have to look at that. As you guys know, if you get voted number 1, you get 25 points. So 25 down to 1, and then you stack up the voting points, and that's the order. A lot of times you'll have a team that won a huge game that's, say, ranked 13th, huge game, and they'll pass a team that was number 10. Number 10 didn't do anything wrong. People will be like, what do you mean? We won our only game last week. Yeah, absolutely. You didn't do anything wrong, but you got a team a few spots below. Like La Crosse just beat Platteville. And all of a sudden that means a lot. And so you didn't do anything wrong, but did you fall? Yes, because you have less poll voting points. And it's that simple. So a lot of people don't get that. And I think it is a source of frustration for a lot of fans when they don't understand why their team dropped.
Yeah, because the two teams might not have anything to do with each other. You didn't do anything wrong, but another team did something great. And so they're getting more votes, getting rewarded in that sense. And that's why they're rising.
Absolutely. That happens all the time. In the football poll, it happens in any
Yeah.
poll that happens. And people, they feel like a sense of entitlement that my team was 10, and until they lose, they're going to be number 10.
Yeah.
A lot of times that happens with number one, right? Is we're number one. What do you mean we dropped to number two? We didn't lose.
Mm-hmm.
So again, part of the fun, part of the conversation, but that plays out all the time.
And that kind of mindset can tend to result in teams floating up higher in the poll than they maybe deserve. Hey, they're 15 and they don't lose, and teams above them lose, so they just kind of float up, and all of a sudden they're 6, and you're saying, what are we doing with St. Norbert, number 6, or something like that? Not to knock on them, I'm just picking a team that has maybe floated up in past years. But that can happen if people are unwilling to move a team that hasn't necessarily lost.
The poll float thing is one of the things that, as a voter, I've always worked. I guess it's always been my pet peeve a little bit, and it's one of the things that I really try to manage on my end is the teams that play a weak schedule. So a team that will be 18-1 or something like that, that just kind of floats up the poll because they haven't lost. Meanwhile, Wisconsin Platteville and Wisconsin Oshkosh have 6 losses.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to put them down at 24. I think that's one of the most erroneous things about the poll is the computers do a much better job with strength of schedule than people do. That's been my and that's why you asked, Matt, if I use data.
Mm-hmm.
I do, because the data, the polls, the efficiency ratings, they do a much better job of saying that Oshkosh has played a monster schedule and Team X has played nobody. So that you're going to see a lot of that poll float every year. I don't know there's a way to fix it, but I think a lot of voters give teams a free pass that haven't played anybody. That's my opinion.
Sure. Yeah.
So we know that the D3hoops.com top 25 and the NCAA regional rankings don't have anything to do with each other, but as someone who follows both very closely, obviously as a voter, and then just seeing all the content you put out last year about the selection process and Pool C and the regional rankings, you've already kind of referenced maybe the strength of schedule. So you use the strength of schedule number to influence your vote. Are there any other ways that you use the regional rankings in your thought process, or can you kind of give your view of the comparison and contrasting of those two rankings?
Yeah, there's a lot of value there. I think the strength of schedule number, when you go in there and you see that a certain team based on the criteria has a 0.600 and another team's a 0.494, I could probably get that same thing from Massey, but I like to get it from multiple places. I just like to see what that looks like. I think the head-to-head play, head-to-head comes into the strength or the selection criteria, but it very much for me comes into the voting. I definitely want to make sure I'm looking at all the head-to-head games that play out. I think the kind of the wins over other ranked teams, right? The RROs, that's another one. So maybe it's not even within like the CCIW a head-to-head, but let's take a game that was near and dear to me last year when Illinois Wesleyan Yeshiva play. That's a huge data point because it starts to connect teams from different regions. And now you've got common opponents of those two teams. So I guess, Zach, there's a lot of things about the selection criteria that I find valuable when I'm making a ballot in the top 25.
How would you so you mentioned head to head, and that's obviously very applicable in both a top 25 poll and a regional rankings. For the regional committees, that's one of their primary criteria. So in theory, essentially, they're weighing it as equal as strength of schedule or winning percentage. How do you see a head-to-head win? Do you automatically lock a team, ahead who they beat? When might you override a head-to-head win, and how does that kind of play out for you?
It's a great question. The biggest head-to-head result to me that might lock something in for a while is the one where someone wins on the other one's floor.
Okay.
So when Illinois Wesleyan wins at Yeshiva, for me, Illinois Wesleyan's ahead of Yeshiva for a long time. Because that was, if 2 even teams play and one wins there, mm-hmm. then the other team's the better team for a while in my book. Now, where I don't factor in a head-to-head is, let's say that Illinois Wesleyan loses at Wheaton. They're both at the top of the standings. Illinois Wesleyan goes to Wheaton and loses a close game. to me, that's what was supposed to happen. Wheaton's supposed to win a close game at home. Um, Now, if Wheaton comes to Illinois Wesleyan and wins, that to me is a very significant. So I guess, like upsets, whatever the right word for that is. So Matt, I don't lock a team in based on a head-to-head result unless it is a road result or maybe a neutral court.
Mhm.
Maybe two teams meet on a neutral court. Like last year, Oshkosh beat the daylights out of St. John's in the gym that it appears that Zach is sitting on, right?
the
Or
Scherp
sitting in
Center,
right
yep.
there. Yeah. So they smoked them. Wasn't even close. To me, Oshkosh was ahead of St. John's in my mind for the rest of the year, unless something crazy happened, because I saw that play out on a neutral court. So I hope that answers your question, Matt. Is I use head to head, but I don't use it like they do in the selection criteria, where it is just a very black and white record. You 2-0, 1-1 kind of thing.
Yeah. To use another example of maybe complicated a little bit, Calvin played a home game against Elmhurst. Calvin clocked them, but being in Grand Rapids, you would weigh that and maybe significantly. But being a home game for Calvin, you would expect them to win. So the head-to-head win might not all automatically keep them ahead of Elmhurst necessarily.
Well, that's a good example, though, of one where I can't remember the records at the time, but that was still, for me, a very big win for Calvin, because I think at the time I think Elmhurst was the favorite coming into that game,
Probably.
coming into Calvin. Now, again, I can't remember what Elmhurst's record was and where Calvin was at the time, but the fact that it was the margin that game was last year, it was a blowout, right?
Yeah.
That's an example of one where even though the home team won, I feel like it was an upset win, and certainly an upset that it was a blowout. So you have to look at these things all one by one, but I certainly don't automatically look at a head-to-head result and just keep that team above the other the rest of the year. You have to kind of put it in context.
Yeah, so I think one of the knocks against something like an efficiency rating or a Massey rating in the beginning of the year is that it's heavily weighed by previous year data, just kind of on the theory that teams that are usually good are probably going to be good. I think that might be a little bit unfair, because as you're looking to get into a preseason top 25, aren't you kind of doing the same thing, just a little bit maybe more subjectively, and then with the additional inputs of maybe some roster changes, some additions, some subtractions?
Well, the problem I have with the computers, including Matt's model early, is that really it's 100% based on past years. So you're kind of, in some ways, you're doing a ranking of programs that have been good the last few years, because you're certainly not factoring in that like Ryan Terrell is gone and Gabe Leifer's gone and Ofek Reef is gone. You're just saying that Yeshiva has been good, which to me, it's missing a huge component. In the top 25, I think this is where the top 25 D3hoops.com poll is way better, because the good voters, which hopefully all of us are good voters, we are looking at who has come and gone. So, for example, John Carroll has 4 Division I transfers. It doesn't mean they're going to light up the world, but we need to factor in that John Carroll's a different team. I mentioned Yeshiva and who they lost. Illinois Wesleyan has lost Luke Yoder, Matt Laritz, Pete Lambesis, and Corey No. So if we rank Illinois Wesleyan based on what they did the last 2 years, and those 4 starters are gone, I think that's just very inaccurate. So what I'm trying to do in the preseason is I'm looking at who was really good last year, but then who returns what. Like if you return 3 starters, 4 starters, even 2 at times from a team that was awesome, to me, you're automatically kind of on that watch list. But if you lost your whole rotation, like Illinois Wesleyan coming into this year, I don't know, lost 4 starters, I'd have to find a way to make some really interesting point to end up with them in the top 25 based on that. So I hope that answered your question, but it's kind of tricky, but I think the subjective poll does better in the preseason.
Yeah. That was definitely one of the strengths we noted, is that top 25 can be very nimble to changes that a computer system may take a few weeks or all season, or may actually never catch up to. I know the injury situation at Wash U last year was one that you at times didn't really know what to do with, because one team you saw early in the season versus what they were able to put on the court later in the season were like two different teams. So how do you,
Right.
as the season goes on, how do you kind of morph from expectations for teams versus what they've kind of done body of work wise to what they might be that individual week that you're voting?
I have a rule that I've developed that by January 1st, I'm 100% locked into the current year. In November and some of December, I'm still hanging on to what I believed on November 1st before the season. I'm still hanging on to I really think that WashU's a tournament team and maybe even a national champion. I really think that. But then by January 1st, I got to look at it and say, well, what have they done? Because by that point, there's enough data to forget what I thought. And that's where I think the subject or the computer polls do a good job of that too, is they start to become all in season based at a certain point. WashU's a good example of, they had so many injuries and other issues that it was hard to make an accurate assessment of them with everything that they had going on. So you just try to do your best week to week to put them where you thought that they fit. And for me, I had them as high as like 5 at one point and probably as low as, I think, out of the poll at the end. And so you just do your best there.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up January. I was thinking last night about your episode you had on your show, your YouTube show, the QCast, with head coach John Baines. And he had a line that I thought was a riot. There's no such thing as a junior with potential.
Right.
In a team, when they get to January, either you've gelled or you haven't gelled, essentially.
Right.
So you are what you are at that point. And I kind of connected those two things. I thought that was funny.
It reminds me of like a couple of years ago. I don't know if it was 2 seasons ago that we all thought Albion was a top 10 team. And we just kept waiting for it. And so like November, okay, they lost some games, it's an upset. And then December, at some point there in late December, you got to say, I was wrong about Albion. And for whatever reason, they're not the team I thought. I don't know what's going on. Maybe someone's hurt, but that's the one that comes to mind for me, is I was sure they were going to be a top even like 6 or 7. And it just didn't play out that way that season.
And we had that with Trine last year. They returned essentially everyone who tore up the strange COVID year. And then for whatever reason, it didn't really come together for them last year.
Or Dubuque last year is a team that I kept on my ballot, because I'm like, I know they're good. And then at some point you got to watch these games and you're like, well, they're not playing like a top 25 team. So you're going to give a team a break for a little bit, but then that's got to be over at some point.
So then moving like to the end of the season, it's easy when you have a year like we had last year where Randolph-Macon goes through and wins it. That's an easy number one. They're an easy number one for most of the season and an easy number one at the end. Do you subscribe to the theory that a tournament champion at the end automatically gets the number one vote? Which, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think most people would approach it that way. But then how do you handle what happens, in the top 5 behind them?
I've always had the national champion as the number one in my final ballot. I think they've earned that, and it's hard to argue anything else, in my opinion. Now, I don't know if some team near the bottom of a conference won the conference tournament and got in, but it's never happened. Yeah, I've always had that, the national champion number one. After that, though, it's fair game, because you look at Randolph-Macon last year, they beat the snot out of Marietta in the national semifinals. Randolph-Macon beat the snot out of Elmhurst in the national championship. Elmhurst beat the snot out of Wabash. You could start to make a case for a lot of teams number 2. I think you could even dip down. You could probably say, Oshkosh was number 2. I'm not saying that that's what I had, but I think after number 1, I start to really go back and look at the big picture and look at how the games played out. And you just do your best after number 1, but I always have the champ number 1.
Yeah, it's interesting actually looking at the final poll. Marietta was actually a pretty convincing number 2 with 590 points. And if you take all the first place points out of it, that leaves only 10 points that they didn't get. So it seemed like almost everyone had Marietta.
And I had them too. I thought that they had the best resume, regardless of the national semifinal result and margin. Regardless of that, they still had the second best resume. They had played Randolph-Macon earlier in the year in a really close game at their place, and so I thought that was the right call to have Marietta number 2. And from there, it got a little trickier as how you line up Elmhurst and Wabash and Emory and Illinois Wesleyan and everyone else that was in the mix there.
Yeah. So in that final poll, how do you weigh a overall body of work versus, like, let's say Elmhurst, who a solid team throughout the year, but kind of really found their footing, made that drive through the CCIW tournament, and then were very impressive in the NCAA tournament. So how do you look at a final poll? Do you kind of go back to the total body of work, or do you take kind of that week by week, right now approach based on the most recent results?
Final poll, I'm doing the whole body of work. To me, that's the easiest one to do because I'm not looking forward. The season's just ended. I can look backwards now and say, who deserves to be number 1, number 2, number 3, down to 25. In Elmhurst's case, they had overall, they had a monster season. They had a dip there. I can't remember what period of the year, if it was like December, January. They had 14 guys with COVID.
Right.
They had a whole bunch of issues. So they had a bad stretch. But look, they won the CCIW conference tournament. They were right in contention for the championship. And then you look at the quality of their wins in the tournament. They were huge wins, like really impressive wins. So they're an example of one where I thought body of work wise, I had them ahead of Illinois Wesleyan, even though Illinois Wesleyan won the CCIW regular championship by probably a couple games, I want to say, but I had Elmhurst higher than Illinois Wesleyan at the end.
You make no secret about the fact that you're an Illinois Wesleyan alum. You're an Illinois Wesleyan fan. I'm sure you get accused of all sorts of bias by internet trolls and the like. But I believe I've also heard you mention that you try to be the hardest voter on Illinois Wesleyan. Maybe I'm not quoting you correctly on that, but how do you handle your alma mater, particularly this last season when they were such a good team, handle them in the poll?
It's a good question. So first, that's why I put my ballot public, because I take the duty very seriously, and it is an accountability check, so that whether I'm putting Illinois Wesleyan 1 or not ranking them, I'm going to put it out so people can see it, because I'm a huge fan and I don't make any mistake about that. Right? I always tell people, if you go to my Twitter thing, the pinned pic is of Jack Sikma, and the profile pic or whatever it is of the Shirk Center, and the thing is at IWHoopsCom. So I'm not hiding that. But that's why I do it publicly, because I want people to be able to see and question what I'm doing. Without question, I am harder on the Titans than most other voters. And so I will never, I would say on average, I have the Titans a couple spots below where they end up, because I really don't want people coming to me saying, you're always just putting your team up there. Mm-hmm. I didn't vote them number 1 at any point last year. Even in the moment that it was very possible that when they beat Yeshiva was they won at number 1. I did not have them 1. I had Randolph-Macon 1 that whole time. So yeah, I try to make the Titans earn it just a little bit more for me. And that's probably not fair, and I probably shouldn't do that, but I just sometimes don't want to deal with the drama of the trolls. But quite frankly, it hasn't been a thing. I mean, I think because I put my stuff out there, people are like, okay, well, the guy's putting it out for all to see, so I guess we can't complain about that.
So if a poll comes out and you see Illinois Wesleyan with that number 1 next to it getting 1 first place vote, we can probably safely assume it wasn't actually from you.
You will never see a poll where Illinois Wesleyan gets 1 first place vote, and that's from me. For me to vote them 1, I would have to be pretty sure that they were going to get about 17 or 18 of those votes, or at least somewhere in there. And that's a good example is after that Yeshiva game. I kind of started some discussion on that. Where does Illinois Wesleyan fit? And I kind of sensed out there that people were still very much Randolph-Macon. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I'm just very leery of that, and I don't want to get involved in the drama.
And I don't remember the timing last year. Did that win over Yeshiva kind of coincide with the 1 loss from Randolph-Macon? I don't remember how.
I think Macon had lost right before that, which is how Yeshiva got to be number 1. They lost to Christopher Newport, but I for the record, I never voted for anyone number one last year except Randolph-Macon. So I was never on the Yeshiva one train. I thought that Randolph-Macon, even after that loss, was the number one team. And I never voted for anyone else last year.
Well, I think you were proven right.
in this case, I was. Oftentimes, I'm not.
Well, Bob, we really appreciate you taking the time to talk about your experience as a top 25 voter. Like I said at the top, there's so many different ways we could have a discussion with you about D3 hoops, and hopefully we get a chance to do that, sometime in the future as the season goes. But now that those temperatures in Dallas have dipped below triple digits, so D3 hoop season's got to be just right around the corner. And I suppose in the D3 hoops community, it's become tradition to give our guests the final say. So what do you have for us?
Well, hey, I appreciate you guys having me on. I love what you are doing. I'm glad you're doing it. And let's do this soon. And you're right. We're now like 88 degrees here in Dallas. It's total golf season right now. But I'm looking forward to hoop season. I know that most teams start practicing mid-October. So fired up about that, and look forward to seeing you guys in a gym as we go through the season here.
Well, thanks, Bob. We'll plug your Twitter at IWUHoopsCom. We'll post that in the description below. I'll also post a link to your YouTube show, the QCast, where you have all manner of coaches, players, committee members on there. So enjoy that. That's one of my must-watches of the season. So I enjoy the work you put out there, and thanks for coming on.
Thanks, guys. Have a good one.
All right. Thanks, Bob.